Welcome everyone. Welcome to the Authors at Google Talk. It is my pleasure to introduce Dorie. I'm Girija Sureka, by the way. A brief introduction about Dorie. She is considered as the branding expert. She is a former presidential campaign spokeswoman. She is also a frequent contributor to Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and other publications. And she's also given lectures all over the world. She's here to talk to us about her book, Reinventing You. And without any delays, I'll let her begin. Please welcome.
Well, hi everyone. I'm really glad to be here at Google today. My journey toward writing Reinventing You actually started because I was a journalist. That was my first job after graduate school. And as you can see, I worked for possibly the coolest paper ever. You know, we had rock stars wearing cat masks on it. It was an alternative weekly paper in Boston called the Boston Phoenix. So, you know, I got to go to any event I wanted. I got to ask people obnoxious questions. It was a fantastic career. But a year into my career, I got laid off. And you know, we probably all know the root cause for some of these things. You probably recognize this ransom note-like interface. And between the years 2001 and 2009, nearly 40% of US journalists lost their jobs. And so at first I thought, well, you know, I'm just going to get another job. You know, I'm going to get hired on in another paper. And I slowly began to realize that that was in fact not going to happen. And so I needed a plan B. And over the course of the ensuing decade, I feel really fortunate that I was able to do some very cool things. I was a presidential campaign spokesperson, as Girija was saying. I ran a nonprofit. I made a documentary film. And 7 years ago, I started my business doing marketing strategy consulting. But one thing that I have learned over the course of time when I was changing these jobs and careers and was so excited because, you know, I would have something new going on and, you know, I sent out emails and let people know. And people would still ask me when I'd run into them a question about the job that I had like 4 years ago. Oh, you know, so, you know, what campaign are you on now? And I had already moved on to the next thing. And so ultimately, I think we all live in a world where we may be on the verge of at least feeling like there's too many connections. You know, we have 1,000 Facebook friends, 10,000 Google Plus friends in our circles, and you know, there's just too much to keep up with. And so for most people, and maybe some of you guys have had this experience, I feel like their perceptions of us may well be out of date by 2 years, 3 years. You know, you run into people and it's like, oh, and you've had a baby in the interim since I've seen you. People are not keeping up. And so ultimately that's not their fault. You know, we have a lot of things that we need to be keeping on top of. But what it does mean is that if we want to be the ones considered for new opportunities, for promotions, for the chance to do the really awesome projects, then we need to make sure that somehow other people hear about and know about what we're doing, what we're capable of, where we are now. But the trick, of course, is that, you know, as with all things personal branding, you can't do it in an obnoxious way where you're just, you know, sort of foghorning your way into people's consciousness. You've got to find a better and more subtle way of conveying your value and your worth and what you can really do. And so that's what I tried to capture in Reinventing You. As someone who had been through that process a lot, you know, whether you're reinventing yourself in a really dramatic way by having a totally different career, or whether you're moving around. I mean, I know at Google, for instance, you're encouraged to get new positions and new jobs every couple of years. You have the opportunity working at a place like this to move to different country offices, to do rotations, to move into new areas. This is a company that wants you to learn and grow and reinvent yourself. But when you're doing it, you also need to be perceived in different ways. People look at you in a different context when you're a software engineer versus when you're doing philanthropic projects or when you're working in advertising sales. And so that's the question. How do you really determine how you are viewed professionally? And how do you make sure it lines up? And so I'm just going to see if this magic large clicker actually works. Maybe not. So I'll keep strolling back and forth periodically. So that's what led to my book, Reinventing You. So there's 3 basic phases to the reinvention process. The first one is really drilling down and figuring out how you're perceived by other people. That's kind of the starting point. The second step is determining what you want to be known for. What's the brand that you really would like to have in the world, and setting that out. And then third and finally, which we'll be talking about each in turn, is how do you manifest that brand? Because once you've settled on something, you don't just kind of come up to people and say, hi, I'm Dorie and my brand is XYZ. We don't put it out there like that. What we do is we are in the world. We do things, we participate in activities, we interact with people, and from that, people extrapolate what our brand is. It's not something we say, it's something that we live. And so the question is, how can we live in such a way? How can we do things so that people are more likely to get the right impression of us? I know sometimes even the concept, even the phrase of personal brand is something that kind of gets people's back up a little bit. And maybe that's the case for some of you guys even. Really where it comes from, in 1997, a gentleman named Tom Peters, a well-known management thinker, wrote a famous cover story for Fast Company magazine called The Brand Called You. And it sort of launched the modern era of personal branding. But when I use the phrase, I want to be clear, what I'm talking about is simply a synonym for your reputation. This is not some newfangled shenanigan where we're trying to spit polish you and package you. It's about being conscious of your reputation. And I think for anyone who cares about their career, you want to figure out, how are you viewed? How do you want to be viewed? And if there is daylight between those two things, hopefully you want to try to close that gap. And I should also point out, the other thing that I hear often when we're talking about personal brand is sometimes for some people it connotes phoniness or inauthenticity. And I also want to be very clear that that is not what I'm talking about. It's not a question of sticking your finger to the wind and trying to figure out what the world wants and then molding yourself to that, or trying to reinvent yourself as something you think other people want. We're actually, I would argue, exiting the era where what mattered most was, do you fit in? Do you color inside the lines? Are you the same as everybody else? And we are moving more and more toward a world where what matters is the exact opposite. What matters is your difference and what you can bring to the table that no one else can. And if you can articulate that, if you can be clear on that value, then that actually is your career insurance. That is the thing that makes you indispensable to your company. So that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about. So how do you go about discovering your brand? This right here is my favorite quote in the entirety of Reinventing You. This is an angel investor named Judy Robinette. And when I was writing the book, I was talking to her on the phone, and she said, Dorie, this is fantastic. This reminds me of a Hungarian proverb. And so this, of course, if 3 people tell you you're a horse, buy a saddle. And what this means, the reason that I like this, is that ultimately your brand is not what you say it is. It's not what you want it to be, what you wish it were. Your brand is what other people say it is. And so the starting point always is figuring out what other people think. And then if it is not matching up, taking the actions you need proactively to get control over that. So incidentally, I was in London last month, and I spoke at the Google offices in London there. They're a great group of folks. And but the night before, my publisher, Harvard Business Review Press, did an event, and sort of a big open event where people came in. And a woman came up to me afterward, and she said, "I liked your talk very much. I am from Hungary. I do not know this proverb." So we will attribute it to Judy Robinette, but the sentiment stands. So there's a few different ways that you can begin to get a handle on it. The first, obviously, which you people invented, is Googling yourself. And hopefully all of you guys, you're paid to do this, right? So hopefully you do it every day anyway. Google Alerts are like the greatest gift to personal branding ever. But I will ask you, the next time you do this, do it with one question in mind. That question, that frame, is if this were the only information that someone knew about me, what would they make of me? Because more and more we are moving to a place where that is the case. You're dealing with people, you're working with colleagues internationally, people who you've never met. And literally, even though we're three-dimensional, fully fleshed out characters to ourselves and in our own minds, to them, you're your Google search. And so you have to pay a special attention to what's coming across and what's being presented there. The next thing, many of you perhaps have had the opportunity to work with an executive coach. If you have, that's a fantastic thing, because having that outside perspective can be interesting or useful. But if folks haven't, because there's oftentimes companies may not be able to provide the opportunity for everyone, it doesn't mean that we can't gain that knowledge. The first thing that an executive coach will do, generally, is a 360 interview, right? So like a circle, they will interview your boss, your peers, your employees, and they will try to get a holistic picture. What's Dorie really like? What's she like to work with? Tell me about her. And they'll anonymize the findings, and then they'll present them back to you so that hopefully you can hear them with an open mind. And obviously that's a good way of doing it, because people feel more free to speak if it's anonymous, if it's to somebody else. But even if you are doing this on your own, I would suggest you can get a lot of value out of it. If you find trusted friends or colleagues and go to them, and you can almost make it like a parlor game. You can ask, if you only had 3 words to be able to describe me, what would they be? And if you ask 4 or 5 people, you're going to begin to see patterns, both of what they say and also what they don't say, which can be incredibly illustrative. And so that's one way that you can begin to get a sense. And part of why this is useful is that we all have blind spots. One story that I tell in Reinventing You comes from an executive coach who told me about a client that she worked with once. And this guy, when she started doing the interviews, the stuff she heard was actually terrible. He doesn't respect me. He's haughty, he's a jerk, he's arrogant, he's full of himself. And so she started to try to dig, like what was he doing that was provoking this? Because it sounded egregious. And so she dug a little and she asked questions. And what she ultimately discovered was that he was not any of those things. He was not haughty. He was not arrogant. He did not disrespect other people. But he did have a problem. And that's that he had a bad habit. He interrupted people. And because he interrupted people on a regular basis, that was the story that they constructed. That was how they understood it and made meaning of what he was doing. And as a result, his career was really being held back because people thought he was terrible. When we think about our personal brand, about change, things like that, we often think that it has to be a huge thing. Oh, it's going to take me years, and it's changing your reputation, and it's so hard, it's so big. So, don't get me wrong, sometimes it is. But sometimes it's as simple as getting feedback and listening and knowing when to keep your mouth closed or when to open your mouth, whatever it is. But for him, when he got that information, almost immediately he was able to make changes that led to him being perceived in an entirely different way by his colleagues. So part of this can be very powerful. I also wanted to tell you the story of a woman that I know in Boston named Mary Skelton Roberts. This is not for everybody. This is not for the faint of heart, but I love it as a thought experiment. Mary, when I was talking to her during writing the book, she said, this is so great, Dorie. I love what you're saying about the 360s and getting the feedback. It's so valuable. It reminds me of that time I had a focus group about myself. I said, that's fantastic, Mary, tell me more. And so she was at a career crossroads, and she had a friend named Dawn, and Dawn said, I know what we'll do for you. We will have a focus group about you. And so she invited about a dozen of her friends, and she was not allowed to say a word. She had to sit in the corner. She could only ask a question if there was a point of clarification. And for a couple of hours, Dawn asked her friends questions about Mary. If you didn't know what job Mary had, what would you guess? Mary's greatest gifts are, the world would be a better place if Mary did what? On and on. Mary said that it was one of the most revelatory experiences of her life, getting to hear at a 30,000-foot perspective the things that her friends thought about her. She said that it was a completely new way of looking at herself that really helped unstick her and move her on to a new phase in her life and her career. So those are a few ways that you can at least begin to get the juices flowing. But so next, I wanted to talk a little bit about creating your narrative, proactively. How do you set it apart? How do you know what you want to be known for? So you all know these characters. I have them up here because I used to work in presidential politics. And one of the first things that you learn is that there's a million pieces of information that voters could learn, that you could push out to people about candidates. And maybe 1%, all the people who are reading Politico 23 hours a day, they love it. They can't get enough of it. But for everybody else, what they want to know is, break it down for me. What is the difference? How are these guys different from each other, and how does that line up with what I'm interested in? And so if you can be clear as we're thinking through our brand on your difference, that's really what's going to matter. About a month ago, I wrote a blog post for the Harvard Business Review, and it was spawned because an executive reached out to me. He was a senior partner at one of the big consulting firms, and he wanted to talk with me because he had just had his 50th birthday. He was starting to kind of think about legacy projects. He wanted to write, he wanted to teach, he wanted to start doing some different things. But he came to me because he said, Dorie, I have one problem. I don't know what I want to say. And it's not because he didn't have anything to say. In fact, to the contrary, this was a guy that had almost too much. He knew tons about the industry verticals that he had consulted in, telecom, biotech. He had massive global experience. He had philanthropic interests that he was involved in. Any of these things he could have opined about articulately. But he wasn't really sure where to start. He wasn't sure what the core of his message was. And so what I told him, and what I will suggest to you guys, is take a morning, and take a Saturday morning, go plunk yourself at a coffee shop. And if you really want to get clear on your brand, if you really want to know what's driving meaning in your life, start to write down some of your war stories. And what I mean by that is we all have stories that we come back to. Things that are particularly vivid, things that are particularly memorable, meaningful. Maybe it's the time you first learned what leadership really looked like. Maybe it was the time that you failed and you had to pick yourself up after failing. Maybe it was when somebody showed you what a real friend was. Whatever it was, you can probably ask your spouse, because we all have things that we probably say over and over again. Oh, that story. But what we really are is accumulations of the stories that we tell. That's how we make meaning in our lives. And I am willing to bet that if you write enough of them down, if you write down a few, you are going to begin to see a pattern. You are going to begin to see a thread that connects them about why those things are meaningful to you. And that is how you can begin to tease out authentically what your brand is and what you feel passionate about. And we had, Romney and Obama up there a minute ago. I mean, I know how messages are constructed in political campaigns. I've sat in the rooms. You look at the polls. You say, oh, what do other people care about? Okay, we'll be that. That's not as a real person, maybe not even as a politician, how people should be constructing their message. I think we should be starting from the ground up with our own experiences, our own passions, the things that matter to us. And along those lines, I wanted to just talk to you for a minute about a woman I know named Libby Wagner, who I write about in Reinventing You. She has a pretty unusual background. She's a poet. She's an MFA. She's published numerous chapbooks of poetry. She was a tenured community college professor of women's studies and creative writing. Okay? You're probably getting a vision in your head of what Libby Wagner is like. Libby Wagner became a management consultant. She decided, you know what? I don't want to do that anymore. I want to become a management consultant. And so she started, and when she first got into it, she was extremely nervous and almost embarrassed that she had been a poet. Because, I mean, even the business professors on her campus had been so contemptuous of the poets. They thought, we can't talk to you. We don't have anything in common. And so she kept being paranoid that people would ask her, where's your MBA? What makes you qualified to do this? And after a few clients, she realized no one was asking her where her MBA was. She could do the work. In fact, what she realized is that she had skills and knowledge that a traditional MBA would not, because she was a poet. She had, for years, learned to study the nuances of language. If you are a manager communicating with your team, if you are a company communicating with your customers, you need to understand the nuances of language, and she did. She was able to work for companies like Nike, like Boeing. But for a long time, she hid that she had started as a poet. But eventually, she came to realize that that was actually where her strength was. And so today, she has an email newsletter called The Boardroom Poet. Her Twitter handle, @BoardroomPoet. She's not afraid to be out about her identity. And I think that, for me, it's an important lesson for us, that the place where we are different is sometimes the thing you want to sand down, the thing you want to minimize, the place where you feel like, I'm not sure if these people would really get where I'm coming from. But that is often the source of the place where you can add the most value. So I wanted to talk just a little bit, moving into the final piece, about how you manifest that value in the world, how you show what you can do. How do you live it? So I'm going to try to not set off this loud noise. There we go. Just checking in on timing so we can keep a good beat here. I also want to say as well that throughout the course of this, if you have thoughts, questions, stories you want to share, please feel free to dive in at any point. At the end, we'll take questions too, but I want to make sure that we're grabbing things and getting your experiences, because those are some of the best parts. But so I want to leave you with a few strategies. Talk about actual take-home tips, as it were. So the first thing that I wanted to mention, there is a sociologist at the University of Chicago named Ronald Burt. And his research, he uses a phrase, which as sociologists are wont to do. He talks about bridging structural holes and the importance of that. But what that means, basically, to boil it down, is that one of the most effective things that you can do in your company to build a strong career, to get known and recognized by your peers as someone with something to contribute, is to become the dot in the middle. In any organization, no matter how hard you try to eradicate it, there are going to be silos between campuses, between buildings, between departments, between projects. People, they're human. They don't talk, they don't communicate. It's a lot easier to talk to the people next door than it is the people on the other side of the country or the other side of the campus. And so if you can be the person, if you can find ways to insert yourself and to build relationships across those boundaries, you can learn things that other people don't know. I know that one of the central tenets, part of the ethos of Google, is the importance of learning new things and sharing it with your colleagues. And ultimately, the research bears out that's one of the best things that you can do for your career. You'll be viewed as a connector. You'll be viewed as someone in the know. You'll be viewed as someone helpful. And that can be incredibly powerful. There's Robert Putnam, the Harvard sociologist, breaks it down. He talks about two different categories of relationships. And one is he calls bonding capital. The other is bridging capital. And you need both. Bonding capital is where you're interacting with and relating to people who are just like you. Maybe they're people who are in your department. Maybe they're people who are, fellow women or fellow people from, a certain area, or fellow Yankees fans, or whatever you are. But you've got the bond with your tribe, as it were. But what is equally important, and if you want to be balanced, you have to have both, is bridging capital. Are you the person that reaches across and builds relationships with other types of people and people who are doing different things? If you can balance those, that's one of the most powerful things that you can do. So we all know from all the great media reports and pictures of Bono and Angelina Jolie, Davos, the World Economic Forum. And part of the reason that I love to think about and talk about the World Economic Forum is that now it's this grand event. Every year, every January, all the poobahs gather. It costs $100,000 for your company to be a member of it. It is an international event. It is an event that was started by a business school professor. It was not something that began on high as the most powerful gathering in the world. It was a business professor, Klaus Schwab, who said, wouldn't it be great if we had an annual conference talking about the European economy? And he did it, and it became a phenomenon. And it might seem, sort of ridiculous to say, well, you can do that too. You can start your own Davos. But I wanted to take a moment to tell you a story about my friend Robbie. Robbie is a nonprofit fundraiser, and like a lot of people, he noticed, going back to Ronald Burt's research, the nonprofit community was really siloed. All the environmental people knew each other, but they didn't know the healthcare people. And all the healthcare people knew each other, but they didn't know the anti-poverty people. Why is that? Is there any way to fix it? And so Robbie decided to do something creative. He thought, how do we bring people together in a way that doesn't feel like homework, a way that doesn't feel like eating your spinach? And so he created a meetup group, free. Just start a meetup group. It was called Socializing for Justice. Socializing for Justice was a monthly gathering where people from the nonprofit community and their friends could get together and do bowling for justice, cocktails for justice, trivia for justice. They would do fun activities and in the process solve the problem. They'd get to know each other, be friends, and it naturally breaks down the silos. 6 years later, the group has 2,200 members. They declared it Robbie Samuels Day in Boston last year on his birthday. The Boston nonprofit community is not that big. And I would posit that most of the communities that we're in, the communities that matter to us, in the end, they're not that big. If you take the initiative to start something new and different and really own it, you can become a connector who is adding tremendous value to your community. And every month, multiple times a month, all of those 2,200 people are getting emails with Robbie's name on it, sending them invitations to things they want to do. And making sure that they remember who he is. I can guarantee you that anytime he wants to get a job, there are going to be dozens of people that know exactly what he's capable of and want to bring him onto the team. So taking the initiative to dive in and get started, whether it's cross-departmental initiatives, ways to meet people, Google is especially good at this. I mean, I know with the Authors at Google series, bringing in musicians, anything you care about or are passionate about, there's a way to plug in and in the process build connections, not just with cool people outside Google, but within the company so that your ties are strong and that you are becoming a hub. It's far more possible than we might think. So I also, since we're here in Silicon Valley, wanted to tell you a Silicon Valley story. As I mentioned, I worked in campaigns. In the 2004 cycle, I was the New Hampshire communications director for Howard Dean, who, his campaign, of course, is famous for, being the first, really internet-savvy campaign. And that was great. Why? Why were we the internet-savvy campaign? Well, we had good staffers, we had all these nice things. Howard Dean certainly let it happen, but Howard Dean is not Mr. Internet savvy. This is not him, staying up late at night and tweeting. That's not his deal. The reason that we were the internet campaign is because Joe Trippi, who was our campaign manager, went to San Jose State. And that might seem a little bit random, but he was there in the late 1970s when all of this was starting to burst, when all of this was starting to happen and to take off. And he noticed, and he watched, and 20 years later, he was there and said, how can I take this blogging phenomenon, which was a niche thing at the time. It's early 2003. It was still a niche hobby. Web blogging, live journaling. How do we take it and turn it into something? I remember being there late at night, knocking on the door, trying to get statements approved, that CNN needed a statement. And he waved me off and yelled, come back later. And I'm like, what is he doing? It's so important. What is he doing that's more important than this statement for CNN? And, he'd be like working on a blog post. And so ultimately, sometimes we find ourselves in positions where we are able to see things that other people are not, where we are in a place where things are happening. And if you watch and if you notice, you can pick up on them. And it can lead you to ideas that other people are not having. Now, a lot of people in Silicon Valley know that computers are great and blogs are great. Very few people in presidential politics in 2003 knew that connection and knew that it was something that could actually help a presidential campaign. So being able to understand what's going on, to see those trends and to get what makes them important and to be able to translate them to the outside world, you are at the hub right now. You are at ground zero where things are happening. And so looking around and finding out where that wave is going can be incredibly powerful. Part of the reason why I wanted to talk about this, go where the wave is going. This all came up because a few months ago I was interviewing, I do a blog for Forbes, and I was interviewing Robert Scoble, who many of you guys may know, the great tech opinion leader. And I asked him, how did you get your start, Robert? How did you get into all this? And he said, it's funny. I was at San Jose State in the 70s. Sometimes things are in the water. And I think when it comes to Google and being here right now, things are in the water. And if you're watching and finding the places where it starts, you can move forward exponentially fast. So one of the tips, one of the strategies that you guys can use today, one of my favorite parts of the book, I interviewed Professor Robert Cialdini, who's an eminent psychologist from Arizona State University. And one of the things that we know about human nature, about how to express your brand, how to let people know that you're expert in a certain area, is that if you just try to tell people, if you say, well, I really know a lot about this, and let me explain why, people are going to tune you out immediately, right? They'll think you're a braggart, they'll think you're a jerk. It's not going anywhere. That doesn't work. But Robert Cialdini shared a strategy with me, which is, as you could say, maybe a workaround for it. That is the email strategy. It turns out that through a quirk of human nature, we can get away with writing things that we can't necessarily get away with saying. And so if you are going to be meeting someone for the first time, in advance of that meeting, you can send them an email and say, Joe, I'm really looking forward to meeting you next Thursday. In advance of our meeting, to make it as productive and as efficient as possible, I wanted to tell you a little bit about my experience with regards to XYZ that we're going to cover in the meeting. And then at that point, you can share your experience, share your results, share what you've learned. And it is all in the context of making a better meeting. When you walk into that room, you do not have to say a word because your expertise has already been established. You don't have to prove yourself because they already know. And it means that you're far more likely to have a good experience and to have your opinions respected from moment one. So that was one of the things that I really liked about that tip. Along similar lines, we all know it's awesome whenever you can have a Top Gun slide. You can't just say how great you are. Does not work. But similarly, the research of Professor Cialdini and Jeffrey Pfeffer, just down the road at Stanford Graduate School of Business, they've done research into the Wingman phenomenon. And basically what this means is that if I tell you about how great I am and how wonderful, you're going to think I'm a jerk. But if Girija tells you how great and wonderful I am, you're going to think I'm fantastic. So certainly this means that if we all want to hire a publicist, why not? That's a great thing to do. But most of us probably can't hire a publicist. So the alternative, the way around this, is that we can have a wingman. If you have a trusted friend or colleague, someone that you like, that you respect, that you would not hesitate to promote, make a deal with them. Make a pact and say, if I talk you up, will you talk me up? At the next reception, at the next cocktail party, at the next conference, at the next meeting, you don't have to worry about promoting yourself. This is great for those of you who are shy, who worry about looking a little too self-promotional. Just set that aside. You don't have to promote yourself because it's in someone else's hands. Your job is to promote your friend and to let the world know how great your friend is. Oh, that's so interesting that you mentioned China. My friend just got back from China and she wrote a fascinating white paper about the latest economic trends. I should introduce you guys. Here you go. Look for opportunities. Look for ways to bring them into the conversation, for ways to help them shine. If you can do that, you are being a good friend and they're doing the same thing for you. Between the two of you, you can make sure that your virtues are known. Now, I would be remiss here at Google if I did not mention social media, if I did not talk about the ways that our digital footprint is shaping our personal brand. This is a blog post I wrote for HBR last year called If You're Serious About Ideas, Get Serious About Blogging. And the reason that I say this, you, creators of Blogger, is that ultimately, blogging is not so sexy anymore. It's like this old thing. It's like 10 years old, 15 years old. Oh, who blogs? But that is also part of your competitive advantage. Everybody's, thinking about the newest, latest, flashiest thing, the 6-second videos or whatever you got. I think that something that is in short supply in the world of knowledge workers, of people who are known for their ideas, is people who are able and willing to contribute to the discourse. I mean, for all of us, we're in roles where it's often very hard for other people to really know if we're good at our jobs. I mean, if you're a graphic designer, you have a portfolio. Sure, if you're a software engineer, you probably have, your lines of code people can look at. That's great. For many of us, I do marketing, right? How do you know if I'm any good? Well, one of the ways that you can put a stake in the ground is to be that person who shares ideas, who writes, who is contributing to moving the discourse forward. Because fundamentally, there's two kinds of people in the world. There's the people who put the ideas out, and then there's the masses who talk about those ideas and share them. And so if you are willing to step up and do it, it can be incredibly powerful. I mean, you see statistics, and some people say, well, blogging's dying because teenagers aren't doing it anymore, so the trend line, it'll be going down. The reason teenagers don't blog is that blogging's hard. It is a lot easier to send a tweet, to take a picture. It's hard over time to make a commitment to putting your ideas out there, but that is one of the most powerful things that you can do to establish your expertise. And even if you are not a writer, even if you don't consider yourself a strong writer, I will point to this gentleman as our example. This is Gary Vaynerchuk, who you all may know, YouTube star and beyond of Wine Library TV. Gary Vaynerchuk is not a writer. By his own admission, he is just not good at it. But he is someone who has a ton of ideas. And we all have the technology, you know it better than I do, to make videos. YouTube is one of the most powerful platforms that we've ever had. People can share themselves, can share their ideas, can upload them instantly from their phones. And I think it is only going to continue to grow and thrive. And so whether it's on text, whether it's on video, getting your ideas out there, I mean, in a lot of ways, it's our obligation to ourselves, to the world, to share the perspective that we have, the perspective that only we have. When we talk about reinventing our personal brands, what that really means, I mean, why more and more people are doing that now is we all know, this is not a world anymore where you have, the job that you settle into and you do for 30 years. Even if you work at Google for 30 years, you could have 20 different jobs doing incredibly different things. And that is a virtue that is encouraged in this workplace, here and more in the world around us, because it's through those connections, through seeing different things and learning different things, that we're really able to do the kind of creative, deep thinking that is necessary to keep the ball moving forward and innovate. And so that's why it's something so important to be able both to reinvent ourselves and also to convey that to others so that they grasp and understand all that we're able to do. So I would love to get your ideas and thoughts and questions, and I'm really delighted to have had the opportunity to be here and talk with you a little bit about Reinventing You. So thanks. Are there folks who have thoughts or their own reinvention stories that they'd like to share? The question is about specialization versus being a generalist, and it's also about mentors. What do you do if there kind of aren't mentors because you're in a field that's so new? So two thoughts about that. Number one, it is always easier to advance more quickly if you are a specialist. In that same conversation with Robert Scoble, his advice about how people can become a thought leader, he said, find a niche, find an unexploited niche that is of interest, that's got the wave behind it, and own it. And then his example was wearable sensor technology. Like, we all know that's growing. We all know that's going someplace. There's not yet someone who is recognized as the definitive expert on wearable sensor technology. If you can be that person, then you will be turned to for that. And then all of a sudden, because of a phenomenon known as the halo effect, people, if you're an expert in one thing, people will sort of think you're universally brilliant and will start asking you, what stocks should I buy? And, when will the volcanoes explode? I mean, they'll ask you all kinds of crazy things. So that's one thought. However, some of us are not wired to be specialists. And that's the other point. It is perhaps a harder road. It's a little more circuitous, I say from example, to be a generalist. But some people are called to that. I am not a specialist because I would get bored being a specialist. And so that means that I've done a lot of different things, and it's sort of a more winding path. I would like to think that in the end, you can get to the same or perhaps an even richer place as a result, because you've had these different experiences that you can cross-hatch and bring to bear. But so one is quicker, but the other one may have other benefits. On the mentor front, I agree with you entirely. There's a professor at Harvard Business School named Tom DeLonge, who I interviewed last year for my Forbes blog and wrote about this. He believes that there's kind of you call it a mentorship crisis in some ways, because he gives an example. When he goes into a room and he asks people, so, how many of you have had really great mentors, really great people that have looked out for you, that teach you things? And he says that almost everybody over the age of 40 raises their hand, and almost everybody under the age of 40 keeps it down. And he says, and I agree with him, that part of it is because of increased performance pressures. In the past 20 years, because of the economy, first it's booming, then it's busting, now it's in who knows what. Particularly in professional service firms, people are called upon to be rainmakers. They have to do, everything they do has to be about the bottom line. And so a lot of the things that are squishier, but often have profound long-term value, like cultivating the next generation of talent, gets overlooked. And so as a result, we're losing a lot of mentors. And in some cases in your field, there's not even people to begin with. But so the theory that I have about this is that we have to reconceptualize mentorship. I actually wrote a free ebook about it. As a matter of fact, if you ever want to Google Mentorship 2.0, Dorie Clark, you can get it. It's one of the Change This manifestos, which is this cool thing that Seth Godin started. But I think that what we really need to do more and more is to stop looking for this one perfect holy grail person that'll teach us everything, and instead think of it more as a mentor board of directors. Who are the people who could be peers? They could be people above you. They could even be your interns or your subordinates. Who are the people who have slices of things that you like, that you respect, that you want to learn from? And how do you go a la carte with a mentorship? And hopefully we can learn more in that way. And so for anyone who couldn't hear, the comment was you can't afford to outsource your brand, because if you assume that other people are evangelizing on your behalf, it's probably not happening, and an erroneous brand might take root. I think it's really true. I mean, politics is a good training ground in the sense that literally you have people who are trying to throw arrows at you every day. They're trying explicitly to define you in a way that you do not want to be defined. And so you have to be very vigilant to guard against it. I mean, fortunately, I hope that for most of you, you don't have people throwing arrows at you on a regular basis. But nonetheless, even without that, people just, they get impressions in their head. I mean, where do they get it? Oh, it's, they saw a Google Plus post from 2 months ago, and, oh yeah, Garija, yeah, that girl that likes ice cream, or, whatever it is. And that's not necessarily the thing that you want. And so I'm really glad that, that you sparked this piece, because for a lot of people, they think, their work will speak for itself. And that's just not sufficient anymore. If you do that, I mean, you might luck out. You might. There's some people that succeed that way. For most of us, it doesn't happen. And if you don't want to roll the dice with your future, then it's important to at least take a little time to be cognizant of what's out there and how you can begin to kind of stack the deck in your favor. You can never perfectly control what other people think of you. I mean, we're not omnipotent. We don't have the ability to, plant ideas in people's heads. But we can make it far more likely that people will view us in a certain way. And so I think that's a really great point. Other thoughts or questions that people wanted to raise? Yes. The gentleman was just quoting Scott Adams, the Dilbert creator, talking about specialization and the fact that if you kind of combine a couple of different areas, you're being a comedian, doing writing, piece them together, it's a smaller universe that you're competing in, which I think is exactly right. I mean, ultimately, when you're specializing, when you're thinking, if you want to specialize, you have to be strategic because it can't be too big. I mean, that's as a starting point, you have to be smart about it. It's kind of like in college, you have to write a 20-page final paper, and it's, oh, well, I'm going to write my 20-page final paper about, the history of Rome. It's, oh, okay, great. You can really cover the history of Rome in 20 pages. It's not going to work, and so your professor always stops you and says, no. Maybe you can write a 20-page paper about the history of upper-class women's fashion in ancient Rome in 20 pages, but you cannot write about the history of Rome in 20 pages. If you set out and you try to be the expert in sports, you are going to get pummeled. You won't ever break through and get noticed because there's just too much competition. But if you want to be the world expert in some variety of rugby or something like that, then the path gets a lot easier. So choosing well is key. So thank you. Yeah, did you have a thought about that as well? Yes, so it's a great question. Thank you. It's about staying motivated as you reinvent yourself. How do you kind of keep going with these uncharted waters? I think that one of the most powerful tactics in a lot of ways is the public promise. Part of why I like blogs too is that, I mean, certainly, we all know of blogs that have been abandoned and whatever, but if you're serious about it, a blog demands to be updated. And it's something that has sort of a built-in demand on it. And so if you put it out there, I'm going to start this, I'm doing it, then there's sort of an internal compulsion to keep it going and keep it successful. There's a website that I talk about in Reinventing You called stick.com, which some of you guys may be familiar with. It's STIKK.com. And you make a public vow of some kind. So this is like the thing you do only when you are very, very serious. And so, you say, okay, I am going to lose 50 pounds. And you put some crazy bet. If I do not lose 50 pounds in 6 months, I will give $20,000 to my friend. Or I will give, even better, this is sort of their innovation. If you are a Democrat, they will say, I will give $20,000 to the George W. Bush Library. And so you are making a public commitment and you are highly financially motivated to succeed in your goal. So sometimes just going nuclear, laying down the gauntlet and putting it out there. But I think that your friends, your colleagues, they have to be in your corner. This is part of why I talk in Reinventing You about the importance of kind of getting your team on your side and finding a narrative, a way to explain it to other people. Because if you have the people around you who are sort of, skeptics, or they're sort of, nagging at you or tearing it down a little bit, it's very hard. And so, but if you have the team in your corner, you can really do amazing things. I mean, there's a book called Influencer, which I would recommend highly. It's by the same people. It's 5 authors, Joseph Grenny, and I don't remember any of the others. There's far too many. But the people who did the book Crucial Conversations, an Influencer, and then they have a sequel called Change This. And they're both really cool books about the ways that you can affect change in your own personal life or at a more macro level. So great strategies in there. And if you're interested in it, that's one way of pursuing it. Yeah, it's interesting. For Dean, one of the things that really, there's sort of an external factor that kind of came in early on, which is that he was originally, his record is that of a moderate centrist governor. that is not how he was perceived by the vast majority of the American public for one large reason, which is that at the time that he was running, the Iraq War had started, and he was one of the earliest and most vocal opponents of it. And so consequently, he got branded as this, crusading liberal firebrand. And I think a lot of people assumed that there were, other pieces, sort of left-wing pieces that went along with that, when in actuality that wasn't really the case. So I think that one of the challenges, and at the time, obviously there was so much momentum behind the anti-war thing that it was more of a net positive, at least in the primary, although you're right. Ultimately, because of, again, other interesting outside factors like the 527s, which was the entity, the political action committee that was allowed at the time and is no longer under campaign finance laws, people were able to give really large amounts of money to target him, particularly in Iowa. So anyway, all that being said, how is an individual brand different from a candidate's brand? I think that when you are working on a political campaign, you need to be really mindful of a few other things. The first thing that you need to be mindful of is who are your competitors that are out there? How do you differentiate yourself? You might have a great record as a school teacher or something like that. That's great, but if you're running against another school teacher, then whatever advantage you had on education might be neutralized. So you've got to come up with something different. You also need to be taking a careful look at macro trends. So the Iraq War would be a big example, or what's going on in the economy, that sort of thing. When you're an individual branding yourself, those things are important. I mean, obviously you need to be mindful, well, what other types of candidates are applying for this job? Or, what is going on in the world that would make me marketable and saleable, in the broader marketplace? But I think it's a difference of degree. You keep those things in mind, but as an individual, when you think about your individual brand, what matters most, what matters fundamentally, is what's coming from you. It's not these sort of external factors and positioning yourself. It's what is true to me and what is that sort of uniqueness that I can convey. And so I think that they are similar phenomenons. The way that they're done is different because so many politicians really do start with polls and work backwards from there. But when done right, it's mostly that politicians and individuals should be looking at similar things, but individuals should worry far less about the external world. I think that for most of us, we can solve many of our problems just by really getting clear on internally who we are and what we bring to the table. I hope that might answer your question. Thanks. So Googlers, it's fantastic to be here. My book is available. I'm happy to sign it if you'd like. If you'd like to stay in touch, I'm on Twitter at Dorie Clark. We can Google plus circle each other, and you can feel free to friend me on LinkedIn. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.